Okay, it is 10:01. We've got a few people jumping on right now, but we are going to get started with today's training and meeting. So welcome to the South Shore CRS Users Group meeting and training. I don't think this is how any of us intended to be to meet and be educated this year, but of course we are adapting to the conditions and circumstances as they have developed. So thank you, everybody. I'm going to do my best here to get this moving at the beginning. I'm sure there'll be questions. There might be some technical, if there's any technical difficulties or questions during today's presentation. While Eric is training, I'm going to be managing that side of the house. So please, I'll instruct everybody how to bring those to my attention as we go through here, and I'll try to address them one by one as we get started. So welcome again to the South Shore CRS Users Group meeting and training today. Again, this is brought to you by the Massachusetts Coastal Coalition, and we really appreciate everybody being here. And especially our panelists, and we'll dive right in here in just a second. Just want to go through some housekeeping things. We set this up today as a webinar and not a meeting because of the nature of the training. So everybody currently attending is not able to verbally speak or use video during the presentations today. That was just to help with our background noise and some other things as we went through today's training. So that being said, you can ask questions or comments to either myself or all attendees through your chat feature, which is found in Zoom. Both the Q&A box and the chat controls are found in your Zoom control bar. So if you have a question or you have issues with the logins, or you have any technical difficulties, or you want to respond or ask questions to myself or any of the panelists here today and presenters, that is where you will do that. And we'll try the very best we can to address those as we go through here this morning. Very quickly about the MCC, the Massachusetts Coastal Coalition, for those that are not familiar. Our mission is to educate, advocate, and inform professionals and stakeholders regionally and nationally on flood hazards. So that is what we're doing here. And specifically the CRS Users Group, which was established earlier this year for the South, or reestablished, I should say, earlier this year for the South Shore. Our mission is to pretty much continue the mission of CRS, and also to encourage participation in CRS and floodplain management, encourage better floodplain management practices. So today's going to be both sides of that. You're both going to get a little bit of the CRS side and understanding elevation certificates, and also help with your floodplain management in your communities. So today's agenda, we're actually going to kind of go a little bit backwards here because the closing and action items, I had a request from Eugene Coles, our regional ISO representative, to open us up today with an update on one of the new CRS, or I should say an update to an existing CRS activity. So we're going to get into that right off the beginning here. We will close with some follow-ups for the next meeting and kind of talk about when that could be. But the bulk of today, for about an hour and a half, is going to be Eric Carlson going through elevation certificate training. So with no more from me, I'm going to flip it over to Eugene Coles, and he has an update on a CRS activity. So Gene, welcome, and thanks for being here today.
Yeah, good morning. How's everybody?
We're good.
All right, excellent. I just have a couple brief updates of what's going to happen upcoming in 2021. Activity 310 with elevation certificates is going to change quite dramatically. We are no longer going to be giving a score out for the elevation certificates. Your elevation certificate score is going to be based on It's called an elevation certificate management procedure. It's basically going to be an enhanced standard operating procedure, but it's going to go into more specifics of who, what, where, when, how, a lot of details into that, and then you're going to get your credit based on that plan. And then elevation certificates, which this is, I think, something that's long overdue, is your elevation certificates will be submitted every year at recertification, and you will have to meet that 90% threshold within that recertification time frame to stay in the program. So instead of the prior way we did it was you submitted at recertification time, we gave you a courtesy review, and then at the 5-year cycle, you submitted all of the elevation certificates over those last 5 years, and then your score was based on that. Well, that's no longer going to happen. You're going to submit them every year. You're going to have to correct them every year. And the one good thing is that the 5-year cycle, you're not going to have to go back and resubmit all those elevation certificates. So you will be looking at them every year and correcting them every year. So it's a pretty big change in the way we've been doing things. So that's something to look forward to in 2021. And that's all I have, Joe.
Great. One question that I personally have, maybe some people are wondering as well, is will that be effective? You mentioned 2021, so will that be effective starting your cycle visits in 2021?
I believe the communities that are going to be recertifying this year. So Massachusetts is on the December, February timeframe. You get your recertification package in December, and then you have till February to get those completed. You'll be under that new guideline of having to have them correct in 2021.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you.
Oh yeah, that's right. Shannon brought up a good point there. You guys are on the March, May. Never mind.
So that means next year then, correct?
Right. So yeah, next year you will be under this program. I forget that Massachusetts is my only state that has the March, May. All my other New England states are on the December, February timeframe. So yes, I apologize for that. Yes. So in 2021, all the folks that are going to be recertifying will be under this.
Okay. Thank you. Any other questions in the chat for Jean on this, or any other? Jean, are you going to be sticking around during today's presentation?
Yes.
Okay, so what we'll do is if anybody during today's elevation certificate training has questions for Jean, just put them in the chat. Note that they're, we'll take them all in, and we'll ask at the end on this or any other CRS related questions.
All right, sounds good. Thanks, Joe.
Cool, thank you. All right, so before we get started, Joy Dupro is on the line. And Joy, thank you for being here. And you mentioned that you wanted to just get us started.
Yeah, can you hear me?
We can.
Okay, thanks. I just wanted to say thanks to everybody. Thanks to you, first to the Massachusetts Coastal Coalition for pulling together a sort of a reinvented Southeast CRS users group. We kind of, the former CRS users group kind of flagged a year or so ago when some key members took different positions and elsewhere. And so thanks, Joe, for kind of wrapping this all up together and starting it up again. I see that there's 37 attendees. So apparently there's at least 37 people that are interested in this topic today. And I just hope that the CRS users group for Southeast Mass, continues to meet regularly and grow and get good training and get to know each other. Because, CRS support from community to community is really critical to help folks get their jobs done, in the best ways that they can. And especially in these times, we need to be creative. And I think there's a lot of folks on the line today that have good ideas to share with each other. So I just wanted to be encouraging that way. I can't stay on the whole training because I've got another meeting at 11, but just wanted to thank you, Joe, and to say, hi to all the folks that are in the group. I hope you keep meeting regularly. Thanks.
Joy, thank you so much. Really appreciate that. And there's a lot of people who are both in today's training and who registered, who will be getting the update from today, who may not be on the South Shore, South Coast, or Southeast Massachusetts. We encourage you to stay engaged. There is a potential in the future to try to get something like this moving on the North Shore. And so for communities that may be either from there or another part of the state, please stay engaged. There'll be I'll mention at the end of today how to stay engaged to join the CRS users group email list that we've got going for these types of meetings and trainings. So thank you so much, Joy, for that. And thank you for being part of this and being here today. The other thing too I was going to mention was that we're probably, as you mentioned, Joy, one of the great things about these gatherings has been the collaboration between communities. We actually were able to meet in person back in March. It was right at the cusp of not being able to meet in person, but we were and had collaborations across about a dozen or so consultants, communities, and others that were really engaging and really got us involved in CRS. It got everybody involved in the conversations around CRS, different activities, and actually that's where this training came from. So even though today may not be as engaging as if we were in person or one-on-one conversations at a meeting, please either email or chat during the today or email us afterwards on ways that you want us to continue to evolve the training through this group, to collaborate together. We really hope to eventually perfect these meetings to have breakout rooms so that we can talk more intimately about what we're doing in our communities with CRS and floodplain management. So yeah, that is something as we continue to evolve in our digital outreach, which is probably how we'll be meeting in the near future going forward. It's really something where we need to continue to engage the people attending so that we can evolve the group the way that the attendees want it to go. So I appreciate that. Thank you everybody for being here. And now we're going to dive in. So, that was your cue, Eugene. You already went, so thank you. So next up, we have training today from Eric Carlson from the Massachusetts Flood Hazard Management Program. So I appreciate, Eric, you being here. And just a reminder that today, for those building officials, you'll receive 1 CBO credit. And for certified floodplain managers, you'll receive 1 CFM credit. No need to reach out to us if you've logged in and registered and are attending today's presentation. We have a log of who attended and also how long you were on the presentation. So make sure you stay for the whole thing to get credit today. So with that, I'm going to stop sharing my screen and I'm going to let Eric jump in and share his.
All right. Thank you, Joe. First of all, can you hear me? Joe,
can you hear you?
Oh, okay, great. One of the annoying things that I have found about Zoom, and it seems to be unique to Zoom and not other web-based meeting applications, is that my microphone and my speakers turn themselves off frequently during the course of meetings. I was in a meeting yesterday, and I'm not exaggerating, in a 1-hour meeting, I had to turn my speaker back on about 5 times. And the same thing happens with my microphone. So just in case you don't hear me for a while, it might be because my microphone turned itself off. I'm gonna make a special effort to pay attention to that little light on that microphone button to make sure it doesn't happen.
Eric, if we notice, keep your chat open. If all of a sudden you drop off, I'll chat you and tell you we can't hear you.
Okay, I'll try to do that. And just by the way, while you were just speaking, Joe, both my microphone and my speakers turned themselves off. So I didn't hear what you said, but I think you said keep my chat open. So yes, that's what I'll do. Anyway, I want to get started. I have a PowerPoint presentation today, and that's mostly what I'm going to be working off of. And Joe sent out a reminder with a link to a couple of documents. One of them is an elevation certificate with the instructions and with the diagrams. And the other one is the elevation certificate checklist that Joe also provided to me. And I'm going to be referring to both of those documents during the course of this presentation. So occasionally I'll ask you to look at this or look at that other thing so that you'll know what I'm talking about. Just a little bit of introduction. I'm Eric Carlson. Joe already said that. And I work for DCR Flood Hazard Management Program. And my program is the state coordinating agency for the National Flood Insurance Program in Massachusetts. So I just like to say that that's why DCR is involved with this kind of presentation and also a lot of other activities related to floodplain management and the National Flood Insurance Program in general. I'm not going to do a big, long introduction about that because I only have so much time and I'd like to get into this. So I'm going to talk about the elevation certificate. I think you already know that. And I will be talking about these following things that you see on your screen. Uses, there's a lot of uses for this form, filling out the form, building diagrams, flood openings, attached garages, and the rest of the stuff. Of course, if you have a question, you can send that through into chat. I'm not sure that I'm going to see the chat because all I see right now is the PowerPoint presentation. I'm
Eric,
not
yeah.
seeing.
What I'll do is I'll jump in. I'll see the questions. I'm monitoring the chat. So I'll just jump in and ask the questions that come in. Additionally, I just want to make a note that some people didn't receive the reminder email, which is a Zoom email. So if you see an email from Zoom, look at the bottom of the email. There's 2 links where you can download the elevation certificate and the quick check. The checklist. If you did not receive those, put your email in the chat and I will resend them when I get a critical mass here. So thank you, Eric. Keep going. I'll, like I said, I will come in with questions as I get them. Eric, we're not hearing you right now. Hey, Eric, if you can hear us, we are not hearing you right now. Let me see. Okay, I'm going to try to get his attention, everyone. I know we can't hear him.
Thank you, Joy. Joy just sent me a text. I don't know where I left off, but like I said, my microphone turns itself off.
Thank you, Eric. I tried calling you too, so thank you, Joy, for sending the text.
Okay, so I continue with this slide.
Yeah, it was actually one slide back.
Okay.
It was for about maybe 5 minutes or so. So if you just do
Oh,
one slide back
goodness.
and
Okay.
okay.
Basically, I said, you're probably all familiar with what the elevation certificate looks like. And these 2 pages are what I consider the most important part of the elevation certificate. I always say, of course, the whole form's important, but this is the stuff that I usually look at and that I use in order to, when I'm reviewing permits and I'm reviewing documentation for newly constructed buildings and substantially improved buildings, I can look at a properly filled out elevation certificate and almost always tell if it's compliant construction or not. Sometimes I need to look at the elevation certificate and maybe a picture of the building or building plans for the building, but properly completed elevation certificate, I can usually review that and know whether the construction is compliant construction or non-compliant construction. So here we go. FEMA elevation certificate is used for a bunch of different things. It's an administrative tool. It can be used as a compliance tool. Some communities require. You still can't hear me, Joy. You still can't hear me. My microphone is okay.
Yeah, I can hear you, Eric.
Okay, Joy can't. Well, anyway, my microphone light is on. I'm sorry, my microphone should be on. Anyway, so it's an administrative tool. It can be used for compliance, and some communities use an elevation certificate based on, and there's a little section down in section C where community can check off, or the person filling out the elevation certificate can check off whether the elevation certificate is based on building plans, building under construction, or finished construction. If a community uses an elevation certificate based on building plans, that's one way that the community can review compliance prior to issuing a permit. Of course, I mentioned already that the building code requires certified as-built documentation of some building elevations, and this certificate, the elevation certificate, can be used to document that and a whole bunch of other stuff, which is what makes it so good. A national flood insurance policy, a flood insurance policy, uses the elevation certificate to determine a rating, and it can also be used as submitted documentation in support of an application for a map revision, a letter of map revision, or a letter of map amendment. So those are the uses that I put on this slide. I'm sure there's other uses that it can be used just in a general sense to understand what the risk is to the structure. I know sometimes I get emails. Very recently I got one from a person who was looking to buy a building, a house, and he asked me, do I have elevation certificates? Of course, I don't, because my office doesn't keep them. So I referred him to the local building department. And it's a non-CRS community. They may or may not keep elevation certificates. But of course, you can always call and ask. So here are the different sections of the elevation certificate. Section A, property information. That describes the property that's being documented on this elevation certificate. Section B, flood insurance rate map information. Section C, that's structure elevation information specific to the structure that's documented on this elevation certificate. Of course, certification in Section D. And like I said, those first 4 sections, to me, I think of them as the most important ones. Section E, it can be used to document structure elevation in zones that have no base flood elevation. That could be an AO zone, which has a depth or an A zone, which doesn't have a base flood elevation. Now, having said that, I want to say that for newly constructed buildings and substantially improved buildings, communities should be requiring the elevation certificate with the information in section C, and here's why. AO zone has a depth, but you still want to document all of the building elevations and exterior ground elevations, the highest adjacent grade, the lowest adjacent grade, those things. And unnumbered A zones. Unnumbered A zones don't have base flood elevations, but for new construction, you need a base flood elevation. So a base flood elevation should have been obtained one way or the other by a community in order to permit that new construction or that substantial improvement in the unnumbered A zone, the zone with no base flood elevation. Section G is community information. That's typically permitting information. The community would actually fill that out. It's optional, it's not required. So those are some of the sections of the elevation certificate. There's a few more. There's a section F in there somewhere. I don't think that was on my slide. I think that section F, I don't have it in front of me. I think I'm going to hit it later in this presentation. So I think that certification when section E is used for the unnumbered A zone or the AO zones. So I'm going to talk about section A now. And I'm going to start by talking about building diagrams. Now, I will say this about building diagrams. I've been reviewing elevation certificates for a very long time. And I find a lot of elevation certificates out there in the world that are not filled out properly. And I think hands down, the most common problem that I find is that people reference the wrong building diagram. Now, referencing the wrong building diagram can result in an elevation certificate that might look like it describes compliant construction when in fact the construction that took place is non-compliant construction. So it's really important that the correct building diagram be selected, and somebody at the community level who's reviewing an elevation certificate should be familiar with all of the building diagrams and which building diagram is appropriate for which situation. Again, elevation certificates that are not filled out properly should not be accepted. They should be corrected. And again, for the purpose of community rating system, when they're submitted to ISO, you want to make sure that those are correct because it can be a problem for the community and their continued participation in the CRS if there are problems with the elevation certificates. So I'm going to go over the building diagrams. I'm going to go over all of the building diagrams, and section A also documents flood openings. Of course, the rest of section A documents the property information, where is the property located, and things like that. I will get into that a little bit also. So here we have section A, property information. So section 1, building owner's name, that's straightforward. And I said before, you all have the elevation certificate checklist. I'm gonna refer to that elevation certificate checklist without putting it up on the screen for you because it's, I think, essentially impossible for me to easily switch back and forth between my PowerPoint, and I don't seem able to put PDF documents up on the screen for some reason, but that's okay because you should all have a copy of the checklist that was provided to me by Joe Rossi. I think Joe got it from Gene Coles. And this has a lot of really good information, and I'm going to go over some of it. So building owner's name, that's straightforward. Street address. So the note here is either A2 or A3 must be completed with city, state, and zip. So whichever one is appropriate there in order to describe the property and the building that's being documented here by this elevation certificate. So A4, building use, that's pretty straightforward. Latitude, longitude, latitude, longitude, if you read through the instructions, and I want to say something about the instructions. Almost any question that I come up with on my own, or almost any question that's asked to me about the elevation certificate, I find the answer in the instructions. So if you haven't read through the instructions, do that. I think you'll find them very useful. And the instructions tell you, item 5 for latitude and longitude, it tells you specific requirements that have to be met by the latitude and longitude there. What I'm going to read here from the instructions: latitude and longitude coordinates must be accurate within 66 feet. So the elevation certificates that you're reviewing should be filled out by a surveyor or an engineer, and they should know how to do this. So they'll enter latitude and longitude there. Essentially, FEMA wants to be able to identify what building out there you're talking about. And it tells you where you take that latitude and longitude. I think it says right there that it's going to be the front door of the structure. I don't see it, so I'm not going to try to read it. And I actually had a conversation with Chris Markusich. Some of you may know Chris from FEMA Region 1, and he confirmed that to me, latitude and longitude. By the way, latitude and longitude is documented not only here in section A5, but later on in section D as part of the certification, the surveyor or engineer will check off, will provide information of how he determined that latitude and longitude. So I'll say that about A5. A6, attached 2 photographs. A7, building diagram number. Now, building diagram number, like I said, I'm going to go over in more detail, and I'm trying to change the slide here. So, building diagram numbers, I think there's a total of 11 of them. So I'm going to go through them, and I'm going to try not to go too fast. I want to cover each of them so that you understand what the building is that I'm talking about, or the building that this elevation certificate is describing by each of the building diagram numbers. 1A, here is your basic house that is slab on grade. Distinguishing feature, bottom floor is at or above ground level on at least one side. So it might be below on one or more of the other sides, but it is at or above ground level on at least one side. In the world of compliance, if you look at actual standards for construction of buildings, a floor and enclosure which is at or above ground level on at least one side is not a basement by definition. Basements are defined as enclosures which are below ground on at least one side. So here's what that looks like. Here's a house that describes that, and here's the diagram that shows basically what building 1A is. Now, all of these things are from section C2. Those are the building elevations. C2A is top of bottom floor, and they use the term bottom floor rather than lowest floor because lowest floor is a defined term, and they don't want the person filling out the elevation certificate to try to make that determination of what is the lowest floor. The lowest floor will determine whether the structure is compliant or not with construction standards. It will also determine how the building is rated for the flood insurance policy. So bottom floor, top of bottom floor, and I'm not going to go through all of the C2 things. C2E is mechanical and electrical. Anyway, building diagram 1A. 1B, I do see these now and again. 1B is also, you have no basement here, and distinguishing feature is the bottom floor is at or above ground level on at least one side. The diagram shows a structure that is above on all sides, but it's, for this diagram, it's at or above on at least one side. So building diagram 1B. And here's what it might look like out in the world. So you have, basically you have solid concrete walls with a slab poured on fill. You have fill contained inside those walls. So that's an elevated slab within those foundation walls. So there's C2A, which is top of bottom floor. That's an elevated floor. Okay, building diagram 2A. Now, building diagram 2A is one that you should not see for a newly constructed house in the floodplain, because this would be a non-compliant house. But it's possible. I mean, people get elevation certificates filled out for pre-existing construction or pre-firm construction, pre-firm meaning pre-flood insurance rate map. So I won't go into the full definition of pre-firm, but it's a little bit more complicated than just pre-flood insurance rate map. But anyway, building diagram 2A is your basic construction with a basement. And like I said before about basement, the bottom floor is below ground level on all sides, making it by definition a basement. Okay, building diagram 2B, I'm glad they added this one. This one's been around for the last couple of versions of the elevation certificate, but for a long time there wasn't a diagram that would describe this situation. Now, I have seen a lot of people propose construction that looks like this, and they say, wait a minute, this is not a basement because it's at grade here on this one side. But it's only at grade because they dug this big hole around it. So that's one of the reasons I like this diagram. Again, that lower area is below grade on all sides. It's defined as a basement. So for new construction, you Thank you, Joy. How far back do I need to go? Because I know that you lost.
We heard you at, nope, you were good through there. We heard you when you had
Okay.
said you had a big hole.
Okay, so people would come in and they'd propose construction, and they'd say, my construction is compliant because this is not a basement. It's at grade here on one side, but it's at grade only because they dug a hole next to it. A common way of constructing in this method, I don't see a lot of sunken patio areas, which is what this looks like, but I do see a lot of drive-under garages. So that lower area would be considered a basement, as C2A here would call that the bottom floor. It would be a basement because out here, your ground elevations, you're going to have your lowest and highest adjacent grade and all your adjacent grade next to deck or steps. So there's diagram 2B. And a couple more. Diagram 2B is another drive under. Here looks like just doesn't look like you could fit a car in there, but it just might be an entryway. I have seen entryways that are built like that, entryways that are nothing more than a set of stairs leading down to an entry door. Like maybe that lower area is like a basement apartment, but that would still be a basement. Diagram 2B is not one you should be seeing for new construction. This one you might. Building diagram 3, you have your basic split level building. So you have a bottom floor here. In this case, it's not a basement because the bottom floor is at or above ground level on at least one side. Then you have some other floors. Again, your split level construction. Here's another building diagram. This one has a basement, and it's another split level type construction. So you have a basement, and then the rest of the house looks like that.
Hey, Eric,
Okay.
can I
Yep.
ask you a question that I know a couple people have asked me that are on here
Okay.
in the past? on diagram 2B, is there any best practice on how the land around the building should be scoped or landscaped in order to avoid that condition? I know there's been some question on, you know, how far out the land has to go or stuff like that. I mean, we don't need to dig into it too much, but is there references you can guide people to?
Okay, well, first of all, like I said, this, if somebody was proposing this as new construction, I would tell them it's non-compliant and they're not allowed to build it. So
Sure.
there's that advice. If somebody has an existing building that looks like this, there might be some things that they can do in order to avoid having a flooding problem. Because the problem with the basement, whether it's built like this or built like the previous diagram, this basement, the problem with the basement is it floods and then it's difficult for it to drain. If somebody has a construction, a structure that looks like this, whether it's the sunken patio or the drive under, there might be, they might be able to, if for like this couple over here who owns the house with the drive under, there's not a lot that they can do because out here is going to be a public street more than likely. And, you know, the town's probably not going to let them grade that street down so that their basement will drain. So they're kind of stuck with this. But, you know, somebody with construction that looks like this over here to the left, if they own this property out here, they might be able to bring the grade down. And if it slopes away from the structure, they would stop having a problem with their basement filling up and their patio filling up and then draining slowly because the water's not going to just naturally drain away from the structure. So there's that. But again, this would not be new construction. It would be existing construction. So with existing construction, you're going to have kind of like some built-in limitations of, you know, what the surrounding land looks like. They might have a situation where they're going to have to, if their basement floods, they're going to have to get pumps and pump it out, you know.
All right, thank you.
Sure. By building diagram 2B, here's 3, I already did that. And here's 4, I already did that. So we're up to building diagram 5. Here's a structure, a distinguishing feature. It's on piles or columns or posts of some kind here. Like it says, for all zones, area below the elevated floor is open with no obstruction to flow of flood waters. So this would be something that would be required in a V zone, but you might also see this in an A zone. I see a lot of structures in A zones that are constructed this way. In Massachusetts, if the area is also a coastal dune, it might be required that the structure be built like this. Again, C2A, so the bottom floor would be that actual floor surface. If it is a V zone, C2C would be the bottom of the lowest horizontal structural member supporting that floor. So it would be, where's my cursor? It would be this right here under there. So that's building diagram 5. Here we go, building diagram 6. So it's elevated on piers or posts or some other columns or something like that. But here's your distinguishing feature. You have an enclosure down there. So diagram 6 is elevated on piles or columns or some such method of elevation, but you have that enclosure. It might be fully or partially enclosed. So that's diagram 6. Note on V-zone enclosures. If you have an enclosure in a V-zone, it has to be designed with breakaway walls. Again, that would be a requirement, the building code requirement for new construction or substantial improvement. And the building code has specific criteria that have to be met for those walls to be considered breakaway walls. And I won't read those, but they're right here for you
Eric,
to see.
we had a couple questions come in regards to the
Okay,
V
good.
actually one on the V zone and one on 2. B, actually.
2B.
Let me get the V zone one since you're on it. Oh, you want to go back to 2B? Okay, let's start here. In a V zone, is the lowest horizontal member considered the floor framing or the structural girts attached to pilings that support the floor framing?
The latter of the two things you just said. So the support member that supports the floor framing. So like the building code says, the lowest horizontal structural member of the lowest floor. I think that's the exact wording. So if you have pile caps supporting that floor framing, those pile caps, the bottom of the pile cap would be that reference point. Okay?
Okay, and the other question on 2B was, in the case of a sunken patio, what if the volume of the patio is greater than the volume of the basement so that the basement can drain into the patio?
Well, that's kind of an esoteric question. I'll do my best to answer it. I would imagine in a flood, your basement and your patio are both going to flood. So, you know, the patio's outside, so that might, you know, drain down, seep down into the soil faster than the basement itself would. And then eventually the basement could drain into that patio area. That's something that could happen. Again, for new construction, it still wouldn't be allowed because that's still a basement.
Sure. Okay, thank you.
You're welcome. Okay, so here's where I left off, I believe. And then I already talked about note on V-zone enclosures. Oh, another note is an enclosure in a V-zone is going to make an insurance rating higher. Policy is going to cost more in a V-zone if it has an enclosure. But they are allowed under the building code, under FEMA's minimum standards for construction of buildings. So they are allowed, but they'll make your flood insurance policy more expensive.
Yeah, and that's
so
and that's
building diagram.
I was just going to mention that that's a really great point because they are allowed under building code. But what we see on average, depending on the size of the diagram, if you have any enclosure below the building's lowest floor that's 299 or smaller, there's a load for that on the insurance. It's about double if it's not enclosed. And then if the enclosure is bigger than that, then the premium can skyrocket. So just because it's allowed doesn't mean that it's good for insurance.
Right. And let me just tell you one situation that I saw. There was an enclosure. It was a V-zone. It was V-zone construction. It was entirely compliant as far as I was concerned. But there was an enclosure around utilities. So there was like a water line and a waste line going, coming up from the ground into the building. And there was a small enclosure, like a 3x3 enclosure, just to protect those utility lines from the weather. And that caused an increase in the cost of that insurance policy. I forget how much it was, but it was enough that somebody called me up to complain about it. And I said, hey, it's allowed, but it's going to cost you a little.
Yeah, I was going to mention, I saw one earlier too, or a couple weeks ago, where a chimney had remained from a demolition, and the chimney was big enough to be considered an enclosure.
Oh boy.
Yeah, we had two.
I think I saw that.
Oh, what was that?
I think I saw that same one, Joe.
Okay, so we must have gotten the.
If it was in Massachusetts, I think I saw something like that.
Yeah.
Did you say there was another question, Joe?
There's actually three. We've got a lot of questions on this.
Okay.
We'll start with the first one and go down the line here. We have a question. Isn't it true that mass amendments to the building code do not allow for breakaway walls?
That is not true. In V-zones, breakaway walls are allowed. However, the person who asked the question might be talking about construction in coastal dunes. Now, a coastal dune might be a V-zone, or it might be an A-zone, or might even be an X-zone. But in a coastal dune, elevation has to take place on a pile foundation. And if it is a coastal dune, you cannot have any enclosure under that elevated building. So that might be what they're talking about. And that is a mass amendment.
Next question is, a lattice or slatting enclosure is not considered enclosure for EC purposes, correct?
You know, I think that it is, but I'm not 100% certain about that.
I can answer that, Eric. Yeah, if you're doing lattice or slats, you still need to include that it's an enclosure, but it can be excluded for insurance purposes.
Okay.
Because I just dealt with one of these in Bourne.
Okay.
2 more questions.
Okay.
Bottom of pile cap is lowest horizontal structural member. R322.3.2 exception allows pile caps.
I know, and that's a problem with the wording in the building code, because the pile caps that are accepted by that exception, and I don't have the code open in front of me, that refers to pile caps which are at grade or below grade. So for a deep foundation, the exception is for mat or raft foundations, grade beams, and it then mentions pile caps. The exception is supposed to refer to pile caps that are at or below grade, which you do see with deep foundation construction. Now, I know this because I looked it up, and I've been dealing with this issue for years and years and years. If you look in ASCE 24 and look in Chapter 4 of ASCE 24, it talks about the very same exception, but it is very specific that that exception only applies to structural members which are, like I said, at or below ground level. That is my official answer. The BBRS, the State Board of Building Regulations and Standards, they have the actual authority to interpret building code, and I don't. So they might have a different opinion from mine. But my opinion is the way FEMA looks at it. So you want to be compliant with FEMA standards, then that pile cap counts.
Okay, we got another question about V-zones. Residential shaft elevators in V-zone compliant dwellings, allowable or not? Oh, Eric, we may have lost you. Hold on 1 second. I will get Eric back on the line here.
I'm sorry, I think you lost me. I saw my lights turn on. Did you hear my answer?
I was just about to alert you. Yep, we needed an answer on, we didn't hear residential shaft elevators in V-zone compliant dwellings, allowable or not? We didn't hear you.
Yes, they are allowable, but refer to FEMA technical bulletin. I forget which one it is, but there's a technical bulletin specifically on elevators, and construct it like that.
And we have a reminder that according to the newest TB1, breakaway walls now require flood openings.
Can you repeat the question, Joe? My speakers went out again.
Sure. We had just a reminder that, okay, it's technical bulletin 4 for elevators, so I was close on that. I know I just sent it out today, so I was close on that. TB4 for elevators, and we had a reminder that according to TB1, the new one, breakaway walls now require flood openings.
That is correct, and that is also in the building code. So breakaway walls in V zones, that is in both the current Massachusetts residential code and the base code.
Hey, we had a lot of V-zone questions. Are there any more before we move on here? Okay.
Okay, great. Oh, I think I haven't done building diagram number 7. Here is your basic walkout enclosure. Now, I talked about basements before. Again, the elevation certificate C2A asks for top of bottom floor, so that floor always counts as your top of bottom floor. But it may not count as your lowest floor for compliance purposes or insurance rating purposes if it is built with, if it meets the use requirements, building access, parking, storage, and if it has proper hydrostatic openings. So this is building diagram number 7. You have a walkout enclosure. I'm going to just go back. And just some other things. There's your AC unit sitting on the ground, which is another problem I see sometimes. I just thought I'd point that out. I see perfectly compliant buildings with cooling units like that on the ground, not elevated, not protected. That would be a compliance issue. But, you know, the elevation certificate, you know, you fill it out and, you know, you read the elevation certificate, and if it shows that that cooling unit is below your base flood elevation, then that could be a compliance problem. So building diagram number 8, we're almost at the end. So here you have a crawl space, which is not below grade on all sides. Okay, so your crawl space is not below grade on all sides, means it's not a basement. And building diagram number 9, the final building diagram, you have a crawl space, which is below grade on all sides. Right now in Massachusetts, we do not allow these. FEMA has a technical bulletin, I believe it's technical bulletin 11, which describes ways of building below grade crawl spaces that are okay with FEMA. FEMA says, okay, if you do these things, we'll say it's okay. But right now, Massachusetts Building Code does not permit below grade crawl spaces. And that's going to change an insurance rating. FEMA might say, hey, this is okay. But FEMA Technical Bulletin 11 also tells you in a few different places that this is going to make your insurance policy more expensive. Okay, so just a couple of examples of which diagram do you use, and I'll just show you these 3 structures. I'm not going to ask you for these 3 structures. They're just there to show some buildings. So here we go.
Before you begin, Eric's going to give about a couple seconds between each question. You can either type it in the chat if you want to answer, or just play the game. I like this little game here. Play the game on your own. Either way, we'll have a little fun with this. So, Eric?
Okay.
Yeah.
So, which diagram do you use? And I'm not going to give you any hints, but you might want to refer to your elevation certificate section with the diagrams. I just went through all the diagrams, but even for as long as I've been doing this, I can't always remember which diagram I want to use. I can remember the diagram itself, the picture, but not the diagram number. So I'll just wait a few seconds and let people think about this. And
Eric, while people are typing their numbers in, we got a couple popping up here.
okay.
What would the enclosure there, technically it needs to be excluded to what use?
Okay. Building access, parking, or storage. For this to be a compliant structure, whether this is an A zone or a V zone, allowed uses in an enclosure below your base flood elevation include building access, parking, and storage.
Okay. And a couple people have answered here. All right, Eric, let's hear the answer.
Okay, so this is going to be diagram number 6. So it's a building that's elevated on piers, post, piles, or some other such foundation, and it has an enclosure. So diagram 6. And this arrow points to that enclosure, just in case you didn't see it. Okay, which diagram do you use? And again, I'll just be quiet unless Joe wants to say something to me. Any questions, Joe?
Nope, I think this one is good because you're giving subtle hints in these pictures here.
Yep. Actually, if I didn't say it before, I want to give credit to Chris Markusich because this elevation certificate presentation was originally created by Chris, and I, with his permission, I have made a copy of it, and I've made some changes, and not a lot of them because he has a lot of good pictures in here, but I've made some updates, but Chris did most of the work here. So which diagram do you use? I'm going to show the answer.
Okay.
Diagram 2A. Now, why diagram 2A? Diagram 2A, this has a basement, and like Joe said, here's a subtle hint over here that it has a basement. I don't know that anyone would put a bulkhead door alongside the house if that was leading into a crawl space. Usually wouldn't look like that. So this structure has a basement, diagram 2A, and that arrow points to the basement. Okay. Once again, which diagram do you use? And I won't wait forever. Okay, which diagram do you use? I have to save some time here. Which diagram? Number 7. So number 7 is a walkout level enclosure. So you might not even call this a walkout base. Looking at it, you'd think maybe it was just slab on grade, but Chris pointed to some arrows here. So you're at grade on this side and at grade here, but this door you see Chris indicates here that this door you see is higher, and you wouldn't necessarily walk into the door and step down usually. So anyway, this is a walkout enclosure. So this one side is a little bit higher than the other 3 sides, which means it's below grade on one side, but not all the sides. So it's a walkout enclosure, wouldn't count as a basement, and diagram 7 would be the one you use. So this is a little funny picture that Chris included.
Eric, question for you on the last one, because we do get some instances where there might be a garage on the first floor and a dwelling on the second. If the garage is like in this instance, but what if it's not below, what if the garage is a slab with no grade difference around it with a second floor dwelling? Is it still a 7 or a 1A? Oh, Eric, you've gone silent here. Hold on, I'm going to remind him. Hold on 1 second.
Sorry about that. Thanks.
It's okay.
That is so annoying that happens.
Yeah, no, not a problem. You were talking, we didn't hear your answer to that. I just threw the question out there.
Okay. Chris has indicated, and I said Chris created this slide presentation, that this side is higher. The ground elevation on this side is higher than the ground elevation on the other sides.
Sure.
So it's a walkout basement because it is below grade on at least one of those sides. So it still can be a compliant structure, remember, because your walkout enclosure won't count as your lowest floor, provided that it meets the use requirements, building access, parking, storage, and provided that it has proper hydrostatic openings. Now, I don't see hydrostatic openings here in this picture, but maybe they're compliant. But the purpose of this picture was to just show a walkout enclosure. It may or may not be compliant. So here's FEMA minimum standards actually do require that RVs be elevated if they are on site for 180 days or more, so it's a 180-day threshold, and or if they are not licensed and ready for road use. So if either one of those conditions applies to an RV, if somebody's living in that, then it would be treated just like a residence and would be required to be elevated. I've never seen one of these in Massachusetts. I'm not sure where the picture came from, but there you go. Okay, flood openings. Flood openings are documented in A8 and A9. If no, Joe Rossi, no, I'm sorry, false alarm. My phone lit up. I thought my mic was off again. So your flood openings are in A8 and A9. If these aren't documented, or if they're documented incorrectly, it can affect, it could be considered a compliance issue, and it could affect the flood insurance premium and compliance with the community's regulations and participation in the CRS. So make sure these are properly documented. So if the openings are documented correctly, you get a more favorable insurance rate. And if they're incorrect, then you will have a higher insurance premium and it's non-compliant with regulations. Those are flood openings there. Flood openings, the purpose of the flood openings is to allow water to flow in and out so you don't have hydrostatic pressure acting on laterally on the foundation walls or acting in uplift on a floor slab if you have a floor slab inside that enclosure. Okay, engineered openings and non-engineered openings. I'm going to start with non-engineered openings. Non-engineered openings are the openings that meet the prescriptive requirements in the building code, and I'm going to go over them. Engineered opening only means one thing, and engineered opening means that these openings do not meet the prescriptive requirements in the building code or in FEMA's minimum standards. Now, some engineered openings might be an off-the-shelf brand name product like a smart vent. That's a brand name you may be familiar with, but there are other brands out there. So those are engineered openings. But you might also have an engineered opening that is just, it's an opening that doesn't meet the prescriptive requirements in the building code. And for that reason, it is an engineered opening and it has to be certified by an engineer as part of the documentation that's required during permitting. So those are your flood openings. This is something I was reading through this slide presentation and I saw this, and this says something that's different from what it says on the elevation certificate checklist. And so I just left it here because it says something different, just to remind me to point this thing out. You can all look at your elevation certificate checklist right now, and under section A8, and the same thing is under section A9, under A8C and A9C, for an engineered opening, it says actual opening size should be entered there, which is different from what this document says, and this is from SmartVent. SmartVent tells you to put in the effective opening area. Well, according to the engineering checklist, you should be putting in the actual net opening. And later on, again, according to the elevation certificate checklist, you put in the comment section what the effective opening is. So I wanted to point that out to everybody. That's in the elevation certificate checklist. I'm going to just go over and talk about the elevation certificate checklist a little bit because I haven't gone back and talked about this since we were up in item A2 or so. Item A7, building diagram number. It must be one of those building diagrams and one of those numbers. You basically can't make up your own diagram. You have to use one of those numbers that they provide for you and one of the diagrams provided by the elevation certificate. I want to talk about what it says under A8. The first the first comment says right there, if there is no crawl space or enclosure, enter NA in all blanks. And I just wanted to confirm something. It says there, blank fields are okay. And if Gene is still on, maybe he can chime in here. I think that should say blank fields are not okay. I think it has to say NA in answer to all of those fields. If Gene's not there, then I'm just going to go with that and say.
Gene is on. Gene, do you mind chiming in on the NA issue?
Yeah, right. We would prefer to see NA in there. I think that's probably what it should say.
Okay, very good. Just wanted to confirm that. So I've talked about A8 and A9. Remember, actual opening size, not effective opening. So that's the way we've been asked to do these. So I learned something there because I previously thought what it said on that smart vent document that said you could put in the effective opening. Good. So non-engineered flood openings. I'm going to talk about the prescriptive requirements, and I'm going to talk about just a little bit about FEMA Technical Bulletin 1, openings in foundation walls. It's about 30 pages of everything you ever wanted to know about openings in foundation walls. I've actually read it. I won't say it's fascinating, but I think it's very informative. So your prescriptive requirements must be on at least 2 different walls. Total square inches of the flood opening has to be equal or greater to the square footage of the enclosure. So for instance, an 800 square foot enclosure must have at least 800 square inches of openings. And we've only started with the prescriptive requirements. The bottom can't be more than 1 foot above the grade, and that's interior or exterior, whichever is the higher of those two. So here in this little diagram, you see the interior grade is higher. So that's no more than 1 foot higher than that grade. It can be less, and sometimes I think they might work better if it's less, but that's me. Okay, so here, sometimes people use air vents. I haven't seen people do this in a long time, but a long time ago, before you could buy off-the-shelf engineered opening product like a smart vent, I used to see people use air vents for openings. You can do that. That's kind of an iffy proposition. If they're stacked, the whole opening has to be below the BFE for it to count. And I just want to note, when freeboard is required, like in Massachusetts, we require in an A zone that the lowest floor is a foot or more, at least 1 foot above base flood elevation. You still use the base flood elevation for looking at your openings. The opening has to be below base flood elevation for it to count. If you're using an air vent that opens and closes, that has to be in the open position or else it won't count. Permanently disabled or it won't count as an opening. Net area, I talked about net area. Is not the size of the vent, it's the size of the actual opening, which is going to be less. Insect screens can be used if they don't impede flood water. I would think that pretty much any screen would impede the flood water, but that would be part of the certification that's required in permitting. Openings can be installed in a garage door or any other door, but you know what? The garage door itself can't count as an opening. I've seen people try to count their garage door as openings. Can't do that. So, flood openings. Acceptable or unacceptable? I'm just going to wait a few seconds. I think this one should be obvious. This is going to be unacceptable. I happen to know that the floor elevation inside there, if your floor elevation was way up here, if this were filled and you had a high floor elevation, that might be acceptable, but that's way more than a foot. That looks like a window. I don't think that would count anyway. And they're both more than a foot above the grade, so unacceptable. Manually operated vent is unacceptable. Here you have vents installed in garage doors, and you have other vents installed around the rest of the house. These are good flood vents. So I've talked about flood vents. I'm going to go to attached garages. I don't want to spend too much time because I've gone almost an hour already. So I'm going to have to start speeding up just a little bit. Okay, there's a definition for an attached garage. It sounds like it should be straightforward, but a garage attached to the structure or an enclosed area below an elevated building may have a garage floor slab below the base flood elevation. Because such a garage is in areas below the BFE, openings are required, okay? And again, you can have openings in the walls or in the garage doors. So I've got a couple of pictures of attached garages. Here's your basic attached garage, and it has some of the other things that we look at for an elevation certificate, some of your building and ground elevations. But here's your attached garage. So section C2 does have a place for garage floor elevation. Here's another attached garage. This is your garage under the elevated building. And that's an okay attached garage. This, I think somebody tried to call this an attached garage, and typically we would not consider if it's just connected by that walkway. Sometimes people will try to say this is an attached garage rather than a completely new building. And for permitting purposes, sometimes for zoning purposes, like you might be only permitted to have one building on the lot. So they say, oh, well, here's an attached garage. No, this doesn't count as an attached garage. So this is also a compliance issue. This is going to show up again later in the presentation. Section B, flood insurance rate map information. So you have the community information, the NFIP.
All right, I'm going to remind. All right.
Thank you. Went silent again.
Yep. We got your back.
Okay.
We have
Good
a
thing I
question.
have
We had a question here. I had a blip. I had a quick call I jumped on. So I have a question here. When are photos required, if at all?
photos are always required. Let's see. It says right in section A, and I have an elevation certificate open here. Attach at least 2 photos of the building if the certificate is being used to obtain flood insurance. Okay, I think they should always be required, but it says there if it's being used to obtain flood insurance. So, so I went silent. So anyway, here's your basic community information, your firm index date, firm panel date, not always the same. And I'm really trying to pay attention to whether my mic is on and off, but too often I'm looking at the screen. Anyway, your flood zone. Sometimes you might have more than one flood zone. If a building is in more than one flood zone, it has to be designed and constructed to meet the standards of all of those flood zones. Some people will say the more restrictive or more protective of those zones, but really all of the flood zones. And your base flood elevation. Number 9, base flood elevation. For an AO, use the depth. Some communities do have AO zones. I know a lot of the AO zones are going away, but there's still some of them out there. B10, source of the BFE. So you got it maybe from the FIS profiles, from the flood insurance rate map. For an unnumbered A zone, you might have community determined base flood elevation. And I said before, any new construction in an unnumbered A zone should have a base flood elevation determined by some fashion. I'd go into more detail on that if this were a compliance presentation. Other source, There are some sources which are not acceptable, and I'll go into that, I think, in the next slide. So indicate the elevation datum, NGVD, NAVD. NAVD is the most common one now on the flood insurance rate maps in Massachusetts. There are still some communities out there with older maps that have NGVD, but NAVD is almost always going to be the one used there. But you know what? An elevation certificate might be filled out to a different datum. I know some communities have their own local datum that they are very insistent upon using. So you might have up here in B9 a base flood elevation that's been converted to Boston City base. They like doing that. So anyway, that might be your other datum that you use. And is it located in a CBRS or otherwise protected area? You can get that off the flood insurance rate map panel, or if you use the map service center, you can get that information there. BFEs should be provided. In fact, all of your elevations should be provided to the nearest 1/10 of a foot. And I very often see elevation certificates filled out to the 100th of a foot, and that would be incorrect. I said it before, read the instructions. The instructions will tell you that those are supposed to be to the nearest 1/10 of a foot. So, firm information, I said before, Zone A, no BFE. You might have a community determination, or it might have been determined during the permitting process if it's new construction. You might have some other state or federal agency that has determined a base flood elevation for a property. Here are the unacceptable sources, and I just saw one of these very recently in a community. They were looking at there's proposed construction in an unnumbered A zone, no elevation available from any place for that unnumbered A zone, and the proponent wanted to use an elevation which he determined by himself by getting the elevation of a culvert that was just upstream of the water body that was nearby to this property, and he determined that the base flood elevation was the invert elevation of that culvert. Well, no, that's not, you can't just do that. You can't make an assumption like that. You can't use a letter map of amendment for another property, even if it's a nearby property, because you would have to have an elevation that's specific to your own site. And personal opinion is what I just told you about the other community that I reviewed recently. You can't just say, hey, the flood elevation can't be any higher than that culvert over there, so I'm going to use that elevation. You have to have an elevation from a better source than that. Section C, building elevation information. This is the stuff that I look at most, because when I go out to communities and review permits and I'm trying to determine whether something's been built in compliance or not, like I said, if I have a elevation certificate that's been filled out properly, including selection of the correct diagram, I can usually tell right here if this is compliant construction or not. I want to mention right here, just to start off, section C1, building elevations are based on, I said this before, you can pick construction drawings right here, or building under construction or finished construction. And I wanted to just say right here, if a community requires an elevation certificate be submitted prior to issuing of a permit, that's good. You can use that elevation certificate to determine if the proposed construction is going to be compliant with building code and FEMA standards. It's important, though, if a community does use Thank you. I guess I went silent. What I was saying here, you can use construction drawings. Some communities might require an elevation certificate be submitted based on construction drawings, which means you check this off But after construction, you still have to have the elevation certificate based on finished construction. Okay. Benchmark, you have to have the benchmark. Vertical datum should always be the same datum that's used in section B9, which is where you have your base flood elevation. Okay. And all these other things you have top of bottom floor, top of next highest. Remember, bottom floor is not the same thing as lowest floor. So the surveyor, the engineer filling this out should not be trying to figure out for himself what's the lowest floor for compliance or for insurance rating purposes. It is the bottom floor, next highest, bottom of the lowest for V zones only, attached garage elevation, lowest elevation of machinery or equipment, lowest adjacent grade next to building, highest adjacent, and lowest adjacent next to deck or stairs. Now, how I determine when I'm looking at something, without going into the whole building code, because that would take me hours, but primary requirement for new construction, substantial improvement in any floodplain, an A zone or a V zone, is elevation of the lowest floor. The requirements are different for the different zones, but if up in B9 you have the base flood elevation, you can then come down here and look at your building and your ground elevations, top of bottom floor, okay? Top of bottom floor. Sorry, I thought I went silent again. My phone keeps flashing, and sometimes I think it's a new message, but I think I'm not silent. That's really so distracting to me. Sorry about that. I can't help that. It just seems to be a glitch with Zoom. It happens to me when I use Zoom. It doesn't seem to happen with other programs. But anyway, so to determine compliance, you have, I already said that, you have your base flood elevation. You look at the top of bottom floor, okay, and compare that to F, C2F, lowest adjacent grade. Top of your bottom floor should always be equal to or higher than your lowest adjacent grade, because what if it isn't? If top of your bottom floor is lower than your lowest adjacent grade down here in C2F, that means that that enclosure is a basement, and basements are never allowed, not in A zones, not in V zones, not for residential construction of any kind. They would be required, they could be allowed for non-residential constructions, provided that the enclosure is dry flood proofed. If it's dry flood proofed, however, you would be required to have a flood proofing certificate instead of an elevation certificate. So you wouldn't be using this form anyway. So residential construction should always have top of bottom floor equal to or higher than lowest adjacent grade. Here's a couple things to look at for bottom floor elevation. If it's a slab, here's your bottom floor, top of that slab elevation. You might have a slab in a V zone. There are situations where that could be permitted. So bottom floor is that bottom of that slab elevation. And that would be not bottom floor for the V zone, that would be C2C, which is bottom of the lowest. Building with a basement, again, bottom floor is going to be the floor elevation. And building on piles, piers, or columns, C2A, bottom floor is right there. It's going to be that floor elevation. And C2C for V zones only would again be that bottom of the lowest horizontal structural member. Okay, benchmarks. D firms may include benchmarks. They might not. Surveyors and engineers ought to know where to find benchmarks. Benchmark is required to be entered onto the elevation certificate, just so that we have a record of what the benchmark was used in order to determine the elevations for that. Here's your certification, and I'm looking again at the elevation certificate checklist, and Jean notes on that: certifier's name, license number, signature, date, and seal have to all be included. And then down here in the comments, a lot of stuff in you can put in the comments. A lot of the questions that people have to me, I tell them, just put it in the comments, describe it as best you can. So you have comments about type of equipment in C2E, location of that equipment, engineered flood openings. Remember up in section A8C and A9C, you're entering the actual opening for the elevation, for the flood vents. Down here in your comments, you can put the effective opening for that. Oh, and by the way, you should always include with the elevation certificate the certification that comes with your engineered opening, if it's an off-the-shelf store-bought engineered opening. If it's an engineered opening, that's not the brand name, it's just different opening that doesn't meet the prescriptive requirements, then you still have to include that certification and why these engineered openings. You know that FEMA standards for engineered openings is that the openings have to be sufficient to ensure that you have automatic equalization of hydrostatic forces. In Technical Bulletin 1, I told you before that I've read Technical Bulletin 1. In Technical Bulletin 1, FEMA describes what that means, automatic equalization of hydrostatic forces. What it means is your outside water surface elevation should never differ from your inside water surface elevation by more than 1 foot. That means that the hydrostatic forces have been automatically equalized. So an engineer who's certifying that his openings that don't meet prescriptive building code standards meet FEMA standards for automatic equalization of hydrostatic forces, he should be referring to Technical Bulletin 1 and certifying that the flood forces are automatically equalized, meaning never more than 1 foot difference inside versus outside water surface elevation. Section E. Now, Section E is, there are situations where a person other than an engineer or a surveyor might be filling out an elevation certificate, typically for the purpose of a flood insurance policy. And so somebody other than an engineer or a surveyor is filling out an elevation certificate for a flood insurance policy. If you are accepting an elevation certificate that's for new construction or substantial improvement of a building in your community, that elevation certificate has to be filled out by an engineer or a surveyor. So Section E, I don't spend a lot of time on Section E just for that reason. Section F would be the property owner certification for those people who use Section E. Section G, I'll only talk about briefly also. Section G is community information, so it's optional, but this part of the elevation certificate can be filled out by the community, by typically the floodplain administrator in the community. So that person might want to put information in here like permit number, date permit issued. So it would be for your own information. You have permitting information that you can put there on Section G. Again, that is optional. Okay, I told you before, I showed you a picture of a building with what they wanted to call an attached garage. I said it's a compliance issue. Here is the elevation certificate for that building. So it's a V zone. Their elevated floor is elevated properly. Next highest floor, bottom of the lowest is where it should be. Attached garage, 8.1. Lowest adjacent grade, and that's next to the attached garage is 8. And there's a comment down here in the comment section. Dwelling is elevated on piles. Lowest equipment is ductwork. Garage attached by elevated walkway. Now this would be, again, I think I said it before, this would be a compliance issue. You cannot build, this is a new building, and it's a new building in a V zone that doesn't meet V zone standards. So I don't mean to pick on the community that where this happened, but Again, sometimes people think that you just put that little walkway and say, oh, it's an attached garage. Okay, that is a compliance problem. So that's the end of my PowerPoint presentation. I'm going to stop sharing and send this back to Joe Rossi. And of course, I'm still here if people have questions about any of the stuff that I talked about today. Thank you. Joe, you there?
Yes, I was talking to a muted screen.
Okay.
So thank you. All right, so thank you, everybody. We're not done quite yet, so if you can stay on the line for just a little while longer, we want to make sure, are there any questions or comments for Eric? I'm going to spend just a minute here seeing if there are any, and then we'll move on. Any at all? Okay, I think we got, okay, we have one here. Who should fill out section E?
Okay, section E, you wouldn't normally see section E filled out for an elevation certificate that's being completed for new construction or substantial improvement in your community. A homeowner or a homeowner's representative might fill out section E without a survey being done, because section E is used for an AO zone, which doesn't have a base flood elevation, it has a depth, or an A zone, which is the other zone that doesn't have any base flood elevation or any depth. Now, typically, section E would be filled out by that homeowner or homeowner's representative if they are submitting an elevation certificate to their insurance agent for the purpose of having a flood insurance policy rated.
Okay. We have another question that's come in. Can you speak to the V-Zone design certificate requirement?
I can. There is a requirement, and this is a CRS requirement, and if Jean is still on the line, Jean maybe would like to, I hope Jean chimes in on this. See, all of the communities out there that aren't in the community rating system aren't required to have a V-Zone certificate done. V-Zone certificate is a form that's used to certify that the construction in the V-Zone meets building code standards, FEMA minimum standards. Outside of the CRS community, that certification is accomplished by submitting stamped plans. And I always recommend that those stamped plans have a specific statement of certification that the proposed construction meets the appropriate section of the building code. So the CRS community has to have that on a form called a V-Zone certificate. I don't have a V-Zone certificate handy. I believe there is a V-Zone certificate in the CRS manual. And I also believe that communities can create their own V-Zone certificate, but that it has to be approved by ISO. And that's as much as I can say about the V-Zone certificate. If Gene is still there, maybe he can add something, or if not, maybe Joe can add something.
He is on. Gene?
Yes. Yes, thanks, Eric. Yeah, that's right. We have a V-Zone design certificate on the crsresources.org webpage. If you go to Activity 310 and scroll through the elevation certificate information, there's a V-Zone certificate in there. And like Eric was saying, we use that V-Zone design certificate in lieu of as-builts. So it's just a form that helps us match up that with the elevation certificate. It's been around a while. It doesn't come up in reminders probably as enough as it should, but it's there.
Okay. Any other questions for, I guess, Gene, you can take some questions too, if anybody has, and that kind of moves us into the last part of the meeting is, does anybody have CRS related questions as well?
I just got one quick comment too about the elevation certificate and moving forward into 2021. To be a Class 8 community, there's a prerequisite for freeboard requirement. And the elevation certificate is one way we use to verify that you're meeting that freeboard. So all those communities that are in the CRS, please make sure before you submit those elevation certificates for review that you are meeting that freeboard requirement. Thanks.
Great. Okay, any other questions for Jean or Eric? Okay. Great, now I'm gonna move into, thank you both. I'm gonna move into the very final few slides here. Because this is not as interactive as our past meetings have been, it's a little difficult to gauge on if there's interest to meet again this year. This was a pretty big meeting in terms of getting some training that was asked for at the last meeting that we had. So, and obviously with 50 registrants and 45 participants today, it obviously was very much something that was asked for, and people really, looks like, responded well to it. We are, as a Southeast and South Shore users group, open to ideas for our next meeting, trainings. What do you really want to know and what do you need to know? And we'll continue to work collaboratively with you to try to get answers to questions and trainings that you want and credits, so that the trainings are helpful for both you professionally and for your knowledge. I just want to make one note. Even if you are not on the southeast part of the state, we still want to keep in touch with you, because we are eventually going to work on establishing some type of North Shore users group. And the Southeast users, South Shore and Southeast Mass users group is really still a great hub, even if you're not specifically on in Southeastern Mass. If you want to stay in touch, go to our website, and it's noflood.org, and we'll have it at the end of the slides here. If you go to noflood.org and you click on the hover over the programs tab, you're brought to our CRS page, CRS users group page. Just put your name, email, and your affiliation in. Check off the CRS users group info and comment that you'd like to be added to the email list, and we will include you in our emails about future meetings, future education, and future potential other CRS users groups. And we all work together. Shannon Jarbeau is on the line here, or on the call meeting here today. She is on the Cape Barnstable County Users Group. So she and I have been working. Thank you very much, Shannon, for getting the credits for today's course. So we've been working collaboratively to help with education like this. So thank you very much. And there's also some comments here about what continued training people would like to see. This is great. So continue to send us those types of comments about the training that you'd like to see. I'm getting a couple now here in the chat, and we'll continue to stay in touch with you to make sure that we're offering those. So again, go to our website, join the email list, and then also if you'd like to reach out to us, if you'd like to become a member, which is free, you just click on our Become a Member tab, join, you'll get our regular emails, and we have a quarterly newsletter, quarterly podcast, and monthly webinars, not related to CRS, but overall floodplain management information. So go there, become a member, and stay in touch. With that, no more comments. Oh, looks like we have somebody that's requested maybe some letter map change training. Somebody else said the FEMA 273 training. So continue to send us those requests. I'm logging all these. The slides, I should mention today's slides. Eric, can we make the slides available to people after today? Is Eric may not have. Oh,
I am
Eric.
here. I'm here, Joe. I was muted. It just took me a second to figure out how to unmute myself. I can do that. What I'll do is I'll make a PDF and I'll get it to you somehow, and you can figure it out from there.
Great. And this was all recorded today, so we will, with the permission of the people on the call here that presented, we'll get this up to our YouTube channel for you to stream and share. So with that, here's my contact info, the coalition's contact info. Stay engaged, become a member, and between now and the next couple of weeks, we'll send follow-up emails out. We will figure out when our next meeting is going to be, if it happens this year or early next, and how we're going to meet and what the training might be. So again, we have everybody's info that registered today, so we will make sure that the credits are submitted for CBO and CFM credits. And if we have questions in regards to that, we also have your registration information and we can reach out. So again, with no further to do, I don't see any other questions. Feel free to reach out to us, myself, or and we can direct questions to any of the presenters here today. Thank you very much, everybody, and we hope to see you again this year.
All right, thanks, Joe.
All right, thank you.